this is Ross Coulthard, and you are listening to That UFO Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to That UFO Podcast. My name is Andy, and this is your end of year 2024 highlights omnibus. Well, what did we expect in the year 2024? There was a lot of people hoping for capital D disclosure. Many were expecting, and probably fairly so, whistleblowers to come forward. More David Grushes appeared to be readying in the background. We were kind of hearing for a while through 2023 and into 2024. Perhaps that never quite came to fruition. However, we got a hell of a year of ups, downs and in-betweens. And in this show, I'm going to play some clips from guests from each month. I'm going to run you through some of the stuff that happened January, February, March, etc. You'll hear me talking in between, and I'm going to play a clip from a guest that I had on the podcast that month as well, and just kind of run over some of the news topics that were in people's headlines that were being discussed on this and other shows throughout the year. Thank you so much for everyone for tuning into this show and all the rest of them throughout the year. Really interesting, and I think if you listen to this show and take a look back at everything that was said, everything that happened, this is just a taste of the year 2024, and I think 2025 from the get-go might prove to be just as interesting, if not more. And I hate to give you a bit of a it's happening soon or a sooning, but we've got a lot of people making claims very early on, so who knows. But listen, let's look back at the year that was 2024. So January, we had a congressional skiff. I spoke to Tim Burchett just after that skiff, and he mentioned that they had someone in the skiff speaking to himself and other representatives to discuss the legitimacy of David Grush's claims from the previous hearings. And Tim Burchett said that they left that skiff with no doubt of David Grush's credibility. There was a mixed reaction from other officials as part of that meeting, and in a few seconds you're going to hear from one of my guests that month. I had Representative Eric Burleson on the podcast. There was also an unclassified DoD report released that highlighted a lack of coordinated approach to detect, report and analyse UAP incidents. Colour me shocked. 11 recommendations were made off the back of this, including unified policies aimed at AARO and other organisations and senior leaders. That unclassified report was based on a report that was released back in the August, which was classified back in August 23. And also Sean Kirkpatrick released his heartwarming op-ed stating his alleged reasons for stepping down as director of AARO. So it was a busy start to 2024, and here's a clip of one of my guests that month, Representative Eric Burleson. You might remember that I almost got Eric cancelled because he wore a jumper that some folks thought made him look like a member of the Nazi party, and it turns out it was just a jumper from like a college sports organisation, and they even ended up commenting online. It ended up quite funny, but it's amazing how these things can travel and how they can look. But here was a clip of Eric talking to me back in January.
And again, I come from an analytical perspective. I'm not, during the hearing, I don't know if you recall, but I'm one that directly said, I think that you're going to have to show me, because that's the state that I'm from. I'm from Missouri. That's our slogan, the show me state. But you're going to have to show me before I believe that, or give me some level of evidence, facts, data, things that I can see and touch before I buy in to what government is saying. I think that I'm leery that this might be a psyop, that the information that they're presenting is being controlled and done so in a way to deceive the American people and put them on a wild goose chase. That's certainly a possibility. So for me, I come about this from a perspective where I want to get to the bottom of it.
So let me take you on a very quick journey through some of your comments over the last, say, 6 months since the hearing. And again, thank you for doing what you've done, because it's been very incredibly useful. Just after those hearings on News Nation, you were on with Elizabeth Vargas, and you said to her at the time Congress was denied the skiff to get David Grush to talk to, and you and your colleagues were hoping to get the attorneys involved. Is a skiff with David Grush in attendance something that's still on the radar for the near future?
Yeah, it absolutely is with me. And I still keep in contact with Grush. He's been helpful to what extent that he can. But I want to provide that opportunity for him to be able to speak freely in a skiff. I think it's a shame that his security clearance was pulled from him, and that he was. And I think that's one of the evidences of that there's this culture of hostility towards individuals who want to talk about these topics. But I want to see him be able to come into the skiff. I directly asked the people that could do it if they would be able to give clearance for that, and so that request is still pending.
And I wonder, what is some of the key progress that's been made since then for you? Obviously, you were denied the skiff. Tim Burchett said as much during the hearing as well. So for you, what is some of the key progress you've been pleasantly surprised about that's came about?
I think that even though we have not gotten the information that I think what some people want to see, right? The sexy information, the biologics or the images or anything like that. It's just understanding the process has enlightened me quite a bit, and confirmed some of the allegations that Grush has made during his hearing. Allegations that the federal government is withholding information from Congress. Federal government is over compartmentalizing. That they are that there's a culture of backlash, and so it makes one think if Grush is accurate and correct on those things that he testified in the hearing, then what else is he correct about? What else is he not, being truthful about?
Another statement you made, so an article on MissouriNet, which is dated the 21st of August last year, with Marshall Griffin, you said, and I'll quote, in my opinion, it's either angels or man-made. I think the most likely explanation is that it's man-made. And I wonder, given your whirlwind exposure to the UAP topic in that time, does that statement still reflect your current opinion?
Yeah, probably even more so. So, and let me clarify, because that sounds confusing to some people. So here's what I mean by that. When I read Grush's report that's public, that anyone can read, in the report he described that one of the theories is that what we're encountering are beings that are extra dimensional or interdimensional, meaning that, and he used the holographic theory that as though we're living on a two-dimensional surface being encountered by a three-dimensional object. Well, in this case, we're living in a three-dimensional environment, and we could be being encountered by something that's of a higher dimension. And when it does, it's not necessarily traveling. I mean, it could travel, but I think if something exists in a different dimension, then space-time difference, the distance may become irrelevant at that point. What I think is the least likely probability is that we are being visited by some alien race from another planet that is light years away. I know in the hearing I flubbed and I said, thousands of light years. What I meant to say is thousands, millions, trillions, billions of miles away.
Yeah.
And light years away from us, right? Whatever you want to call it, it's a long way. It's a really long way to anywhere, and it's a long way in any direction. So the probability of some other alien race evolving to that level, and then deciding to, of all places, come this direction, and then, as I said in the hearing, they've got the technology to get here and invest all that time to get here and energy to get here, and then they crash. I don't buy it. I do think that the extra dimensional theory is intriguing to me, but again, I'd have to see more. I'd have to see something to make me believe that it's true. I do think, though, that it's more likely, at least unless someone can give me evidence otherwise, I think it's more likely that it would be something extra dimensional than it would be within this dimension. And so what I'll say is that when you start talking about things in that nature, that they're extra dimensional, well, in a lot of different scriptures, including the Bible and others. That's really the way that you describe messengers of God, or angels. And so they may not fit exactly the biblical narrative, but whenever I use the term angels, to me it's synonymous with an extra dimensional being. But the most likely, in my opinion, the most likely thing is that what we're seeing. Again, I do not discount. I think that what's being recorded visually, what's being seen, and what we're hearing testimony from pilots, I think they're actually seeing things, and I think that evidence. There's plenty of evidence of these objects that we don't know what they are. What I don't want to, but I think the most likely conclusion may not be as what everyone wants to hear, but it may very well be that it's technology that's being developed and researched, or including potentially new propulsion technology. Here's what I say whenever I talk about that topic, is that we discovered the Higgs boson particle, 10 years ago? It was discovered. We discovered the Higgs field, which is really the field for gravity, and the particle, which is a wave function within that field. And if you think about it, not long after they discovered nuclear fission did they invent the nuclear bomb. Okay? That's where scientists took theory and converted it into function. And I just can't imagine that we've not been able to capitalize, or that our private sector industry or the scientific community has not been able to determine ways in which to manipulate the Higgs field.
On to February 2024, and perhaps a bit of a quieter month when you look back on the year as a whole. The Sol videos came out from the symposium, from Sol's first symposium back in late 2023. Those included keynotes from David Grush and slides from Carl Nell discussing catastrophic disclosure. Those had kind of gone a little bit viral at the time of the conference, but this was the first time people were getting to see the videos and whatnot. And that's resonated with many. I would recommend folks go back and check those videos out from Sol back in 2023 and the recent one in 2024 as well. But yeah, that was a kind of quiet February. But here is a note and a clip from guest Lester Nari, who is part of UAPcaucus.com. He founded that. Lester's a wonderful speaker on the UFO topic, and he, along with several others, are doing some wonderful work behind the scenes in Washington to really move this topic forward politically. So here's a clip of Lester. You mentioned the media cycle before, where we saw, frustratingly, a repeat, I think, of what we've seen in previous years, where there's a period of weeks, maybe I'm being generous to say a month or two, where mainstream media pick up a story, run with it, and then it goes away again, and we can never seem to have it stay or really click into gear. 2023, it was the Grush story, and his comments really did translate worldwide to the point we had it here in the UK. I was fortunate to speak on some radio shows and TV shows even about it. This face on TV was terrifying. People cancel TV licenses worldwide. I know, but that was how big an impact it had. People wanted to know, who were like, this guy's saying some really incredible things. It lasted in the UK, if I'm right, the Grush comments kind of hit the news cycle on like the Wednesday or the Thursday, and by the Tuesday after in the UK, the story was gone. That was it. So not even a full calendar week, I don't think. A 7-day cycle. Lasted longer in the States because it's someone from the US government, somebody who's speaking, saying incredible things in Congress. The people who were coming out, like your Lunar, Burchett's, Burlesons, Gates, who were talking about this, but it still went away. How do we get that to kick in but stay a focus of the mainstream media?
There are a couple of, I think, variables to this. I think it's a really great point and a really great question. There's obviously the stigma that's existed in the media, and part of it is a generational thing, whereas you see older producers start to age out and younger producers starting to come in, they're naturally just going to be more open-minded about giving the topic some airtime. So I think there is sort of inertia in the media space to stick to the things that they know that work. And frankly, I think we all know, like, the UFO content, like when it's having official channels and stuff, gets plenty of views and would drive revenue. But I think the generational stigma for producers who choose what they focus on is part of the problem. So that's just a waiting game to one extent. I think the other aspect to this is, how do you define what's newsworthy, right? And how do we create more opportunities for there to be things that are, quote, newsworthy related to the UAP topic? And I think part of how we can get there is one of the kind of concepts that Ryan Graves talks about, which is there's actually two paths that we need to be focusing on in tandem right now. One side is the disclosure path, the government documentation, the whistleblowers, and like what materials do they have or not have. And then the other path is the discovery path, which is what we're seeing with Sol, Galileo Project, the new Lumina Journal for UAP Studies. There needs to be a dispersion of the sources that are cultivating new things about the topic, because then there are now more opportunities for folks to say, oh, if we don't want to cover it from this political angle, oh, the Sol conference, or what Dr. Jacques Vallée is talking about, where you might see the San Francisco Chronicle cover it because he's a legend in the Valley here in the California area. And there's a context for them to consider it to be newsworthy. So I think expanding the sandbox of things that are actually being worked on, built, the infrastructure to maintain the story when the media doesn't continue it, is a big aspect to this. I mean, this is what you've been doing, right? And what a lot of online media channels have been doing already. And I think just continuing to grow that base, we sort of need to be the ones to maintain it, because currently we're in we're in a reactive state where we wait for the next drop from an insider or wait for the next report to come out and then react to that and say, oh, look. I think instead there needs to be a proactive position which identifies what are the areas in which we need to make progress. And I think there are quite a few. As an example, there's no way to onboard someone who doesn't know anything about this issue into the topic. What do I mean by that? It's very difficult for someone to get a base understanding. UAP Guide tries to do this with a little bit of just the basic information, quotes, but for the most part, the content we create as a community is for the community of people who already understand all this information, but there is no infrastructure for the people who don't know who Kirkpatrick is or what arrow means or how the different levels of government classification work. So there's almost needs to be an educational arm to the community that builds out material that assumes people know nothing, right? And then also gives them an entry point from different aspects. Some people care about the government aspect. Some people are more interested in the experiencer aspect and the story of real people. So that infrastructure outside of the media, I think, will help bubble up more newsworthy opportunities for them to pick up that are not solely waiting for the government to take action. And then there's a whole variety of other reasons why I think that'll help lift up all boats. But that's kind of how I think about the problem, if that makes sense.
In March 2024, there was a UAP rally on the streets of New York City where a small number of folks gathered outside of Senator Chuck Schumer's office to show support for his efforts in crafting the Schumer-Rounds Amendment, or as other folks knew it, the UAP Disclosure Act, which of course had failed to get through substantially in 2023 and has done so again in 2024. It was a bit of a last-minute rally, but it was nice to see some folks managing to get out there and raise some awareness and also show appreciation for Chuck Schumer's efforts. From the streets and the political aspect of the topic, it moved to a hotel in Los Angeles where members of the Hollywood Disclosure Alliance and others hosted a faulty affair discussing aspects of the Peruvian Mexican alien mummies that have dipped in and out the news now for what seems an eternity. For me, this event was a disaster and personally it left a bad taste in my mouth. It looked bad, the presentation was bad, and there were so many issues for folks trying to watch this across multiple platforms. It represented what can be wrong with this topic for me, especially when folks with a bit of money and a bit of clout and a bit of power and influence get a hold of something potentially promising. And that's not to downplay or dismiss what may come from these samples, these biologics. But yeah, this wasn't a good look at the time. you can praise them for getting involved and everything else. But yeah, if you choose to go back and watch that whole presentation, I don't get good vibes from it, folks. Let's put it that way. And also in March, Three Body Problem debuted on Netflix. Some called it Friends with Aliens. I said before at the time, on YouTube you can watch, and Amazon Prime has it as well, but you have to pay for some of the episodes. The Chinese version, which is around 24 or 27 episodes, I think. And yes, it's subtitled, but if you don't mind that sort of thing, it's wonderful. I don't mind subtitles. And it goes into the characters, the story in a lot more detail. It's really fleshed out and it builds. It can be a bit of a slow burn, but the payoffs are worth it along the way. Whereas the Three Body Problem on Netflix is very westernified, Americanified, and it's short, gets to the point. 8 episodes, has some good bits. I don't like some of the characters or folks portrayed within it. Very different to the actual books as well. But it got millions and millions and millions of eyes on the UFO topic and thinking about it a little bit differently as well. So if folks haven't watched it, it's harmless. And over this holiday period, over New Year, check out Three Body Problem on Netflix. But maybe invest a little bit of time in the Chinese version that is available on YouTube and other platforms. I paid for some of the episodes because I really wanted to see them. Season 2 has been signed off for both versions, which is good to hear as well. So that was a positive. And a guest I'm going to play a clip from that month was none other than Whitley Strieber. So here's a clip of Whitley Strieber to round off March 2024. Let me ask, just to try and comprehend that scenario a little more. If we have these visitors show up and, like you say, it's the same visitors who have been performing these, violations against people, which is what they are, do you foresee any other visitors potentially showing up at the same time who are maybe more friendly or sympathetic to the human cause? Or how do you foresee that playing out?
My experience of the visitors is that they are not that they are not sympathetic, but, well, I'll give you an example of how they are. I had sexual relationships with one of them in the mid-1980s, extensively. I mean, it is not, I'm not lying and I'm not mistaken. I remember it in perfect detail. And I've written about it. It's in Supernatural. It's probably in other places too. I write so much. God knows what I've written. Anyway, then 11 years later, this bizarre child appeared in our woods behind our house, living rough in the woods. And at the time, I did not know what to make of this because he had certain capabilities. He could easily and fluently get into my mind and interact with me telepathically. And those interactions were very disturbing, very disturbing. He was not right. There were things wrong with him. His affect was that of an extremely autistic individual and someone with a lot of schizophrenic affect as well. And I think they dropped him in the woods behind our house because he was partly me from that sexual relationship. And they just couldn't handle him because he hadn't worked out. And so they left him in my yard without so much as a by your leave. Now, this is what we're going to have to deal with. And I know everyone wants to believe, oh, there are Palladians, and this group and that group, and that's all folklore. That's just us talking to ourselves. The facts on the ground are that we have seen very little of those people, not that they don't exist, because I have had significant experience with them. But they're gone from here now. I haven't seen them in years, any of them, and I don't think anyone has. So what happened to them? I think we're going to have to deal with the Greys. I think that's who's going to be here when push comes to shove. And we're going to be dealing with something that is not like us at all, that does not have the same kind of emotional experience that we do, not at all, and which sees us more as we might see sheep, not as a fox might see a rabbit, but as a farmer might see, or a shepherd might see his sheep, that he cultivates over a season to get wool from, and then takes the wool and puts the sheep back out to pasture and cultivates another harvest of wool for the next year. And that's what's happening here. And I think this wool, in our case, is experience that we have gained in our lives. And quite frankly, I think if the situation becomes too overwhelming and the planet's environment breaks down in too many different ways, they're going to go to a second line of defense. And that's what all of these abductions and the taking of sperm and eggs were about. I think they've got another Earth somewhere that they're cultivating right now, frankly. I think there's a very strong possibility that they are going to leave us go when it becomes too difficult to maintain us.
In April 2024, pretty interesting month where the Kona Blue Notes were declassified. Now, this was a briefing or a presentation, a kind of slide deck from an alleged or prospective special access program that didn't happen, allegedly. And I say allegedly. I'm not saying it did, but you never know, do you? It would have been to study and investigate advanced materials and technologies, including materials of non-human origin, sorry. And it came about after OSAP, and it would have been under the Department of Homeland Security umbrella. It never quite happened, as far as we know, and it was a nice peek of what sort of thing... or what this kind of thing may look like, especially when it's in the prospective stage. Some still think the whole situation was fishy, that the document wasn't legitimate. Others say it was legitimate. Others have said that, maybe it did happen, but with a different name. Who knows? But it was an interesting little side note for that month. Also in April, another classified SCIF took place in Washington. And for folks, I should mention, a SCIF is just a meeting in a secure location, which I think it's Secure Compartmentalized Information Facility. I may have got that slightly wrong, but I'm doing this off the cuff. And that is, it can be any room as long as it's secure, no mobile phones, no recording devices, information discussed within that room stays within that room and the folks involved. Now, that took place in Washington with the UAP caucus that is put together, including members Tim Burchett, Anna Paulina Luna, Andy Ogles and others. They were really unhappy coming out of it that they weren't getting the answers they were looking for in investigating the UAP topic. They found the briefing lacked any substance. And this was a pattern that unfortunately had gone on and has gone on through the entire year. If you've listened to this podcast or other outlets, you will know that. And from that month, it was really great to speak to Richard Dolan. And here is a clip with Richard. Richard will join me on the podcast in the coming months once his new USO series is ready to be published. So I'm looking forward to that. But I'll hand over to a clip from Richard. That book, Richard, is AD After Disclosure, co-authored with Bryce Zabel, very popular in the Discord chat for the podcast. The guys in there and girls are always talking about it. And that, I think, moves me on nicely to the real chunk and meaty part of the interview I want to get to. You mentioned earlier the book you're researching, and I think it ties in nicely with the Sol Foundation. Rear Admiral Timothy Gallaudet published the Sol's first white paper on USOs, that's unidentified submersible or submerged objects, underwater UFOs essentially. This is something you have researched over 600 cases, I believe now, for your upcoming work. Yeah. So let's talk USOs, and I wonder, how much do you feel this is part of the conversation that, no pun intended, has gone under the radar?
Well, yes, it's a really fortuitous coincidence, frankly, that I decided to go into this subject at a time when I wasn't really quite aware that there were some other folks who were really going into this subject. So that's good. In fact, with Admiral Tim Gallaudet, I communicate with him, and he actually has an early PDF version of my book. I'm continually working that, but so he's aware of my work on this. But this is, it's a mind-blowing research. I have to say, for me personally, it's been mind blowing. And for me to say that, I've been doing the UFO subject now for 30 years, 30. And it's been a while since I've researched something that really made me feel that I was almost a newbie, like starting at square one. But the USO subject was kind of like that, because I don't think I really truly appreciated just how many good cases there are, and how scattered they have been all of these years. They're just in some in this database over here, and then there's another database there, and then there's this book over here, and a couple of blog posts over here. Like, they're just not put together in any coherent way. There have been a couple of decent books on the subject over the years, none of them comprehensive, not even attempting to be comprehensive. So I thought, I started doing this about 2 years ago in answering a question from a member of my website. I have a website called Rich and Nolan Members, and someone was asking me about a case that took place in 1945 off the coast of the Aleutian Islands, between Alaska and Russia. And it's a pretty good case. I'd known a little bit about it, and I just did a little bit of a dive. And the object is believed, it's not known, but it's believed to have come out of the water and circled a U.S. transport ship at that time during the summer of 1945. So I did a little thing on that, and that was fun. And then I thought, let's take a look at a few other of these cases. And this is all in the late spring of 2022. And then I just got into more cases and more, and folks on my website liked it. And I ended up doing all of these private little presentations on all of these cases. And it just morphed into a full-on project. So I decided to access all of there's whatever major databases. So there's the National UFO Reporting Center, which is very difficult to go through, but I've gone through it. I've gone through that entire, figured out how I can do searches on it and all of that. I was able to access, before it folded, before it went away, the website of the late Carl Feint, who just died a few years ago. Carl was a really great guy and an excellent researcher who focused on UFOs and their effects on water and the effects of water on UFOs. And that included a lot of USO cases, although his interest went beyond just USOs. It was anything with UFOs and water. So UFOs in rain or rainstorms, or UFOs in fog, or UFOs in snow. But he collected a lot of USO cases as well. And then MUFON was really gracious to me, and they gave me access to their CMS. That's their computer, their case management system. And then lots of other books. It's just a matter of hunting, finding used books, paying $60, $70 for a used book that's been out of print for 40 years, but it's got a couple of cases in there I need. So I was just scrounging them up and putting them together. And so what I've done is, I've collected more than 600 now. And I will have to publish it in 2 volumes simultaneously. So they'll both come out at the same time. But and I'm getting it illustrated. I've got a map. I've got a complete Google Earth map with pins with the location of every one of these cases, which I'll show that for the book somehow. And then I'm creating a bunch of appendices as well. So with each case, I've created about 15 categories for each case: size of object, color, shape, distance of the witness to the object, and so and more. Did the object, was it transmedium? Did it enter the water? Did it emerge from the water? What type of body of water? Was it an ocean or a river or a lake or a reservoir or whatever? So I have all of these factors that I've put in for each one of these cases, and I'm just about done with those categories. So, and then once that's done, I need someone who's with good spreadsheet skills, who's going to put that together in a spreadsheet for me so I can do some proper analysis of that. And that'll be part of the book as well. So it's exciting. I think one thing I could say is, of the 600 plus cases, I can't definitively say that I know that every one of those is a bona fide USO case. But I will be very confident in saying that at least 3/4 probably are. I definitely think so. These are a lot of very specific testimony. And I think these are excellent cases. So you're talking about a worldwide phenomenon, every major body of water, and a shocking number of transmedium cases. They're not just below the water, in other words. They're coming out of the water. They're entering the water. They're entering and coming out, or they're coming out and then re-entering. Bizarre, really bizarre. It's fascinating, and there's several centuries worth of good ones. So I really try to be very careful. And how far back in time do I consider these cases to be legit? And I'm just going to say I have not found. I have a bit of a discussion on my attitude about the early alleged cases, such as they are. There's not that many anyway. But the first really definitively one that I could say, this one I believe, did not occur until the 18th century, in the year 1717, not too far from Martinique in the Caribbean. That one I believe is probably legit. And then starting in the early 19th century, a bunch of really, really solid ones that are very, very well documented, well attested. But going back earlier, I'm not saying there were none, but I don't have a lot of confidence in any of the earlier ones.
Not to spoil the content, Richard, and it's been well researched, but for example, that 1717 event, what about it? It very quickly happened, and why is it genuine for you?
Yeah, that one took place. There was a French ship in the Caribbean. It was somewhere southwest of Martinique, and the captain of that ship, what the heck was his name? I'm going to search now. You're making me look for this.
No, that's all right.
It was a frigate known as La Valeur. Oh, and the captain was named the Chevalier de Ricourt. And he wrote in his ship's journal, and I have it right here. He says, at 2 a.m, this is in March 6, 1717. So a little over 300 years ago. He said, at 2 a.m, we were making some progress in a southeast direction. We saw something like the mast of a ship pass alongside, standing up about 2 feet above the water. And that's in his ship's journal. That's not the most solid USO case that I've ever come across, but it's not bad. Like, what I like about it is he's not trying to interpret it as a sign or as a portent from the heavens. He's very, very matter of fact. 2 a.m, I was actually trying to find out where was the moon. Was there a full moon? It turns out there was a half moon. As far as I could tell, there was a half moon visible, so there was some visibility there, and some ability to see hovering out like the mass of a ship. So I'm thinking a vertical object that was above the water that went by the ship. Now, that's not technically in the water. You couldn't say it's technically USO, but I'd say close enough.
Yeah,
it's a pretty darn good. What's that thing doing out there in 1717? A much better one was from a century later by an English ship not far from Hawaii, and I will mention that one. To me, this is a great one from 1825, and we have the exact date, August 12th, 1825. They were somewhere near Hawaii. I don't have the exact coordinates, but there was a ship, and on this ship was a medic named Andrew Bloxam, Bloxam, Bloxam. And he writes, now listen to this. This is quite amazing. 1825, about 3:30 this morning. So 3:30 a.m. So it's black, other than whatever starlight or moonlight there was. At 3:30 this morning, the middle watch on deck was astonished to find everything around them suddenly illuminated. Turning their eyes eastward, they beheld a large, round, luminous body rising up about 7 degrees, apparently from the water, to the clouds and falling again out of sight. And a second time, rising and falling. It was the color of a red-hot cannon shot and appeared about the size of the sun. It gave so great a light that a pin might be picked up on deck. So what's interesting is that you've got a situation where it happened 2 times, according to this testimony. And again, we're in 1825. No one's thinking about UFOs, obviously. It's farthest from his mind. It's, as far as they know, it's a natural occurrence. And indeed, you could ask, could this have been some kind of natural phosphorescence or natural occurrence? But I have not been able to find the slightest scientific support for any kind of naturalistic event. And I just don't know what it could be other than something artificial happening twice, giving off a great illumination. And by the way, this is something that is repeated, these orange orbs. This is a very particular subset of USO reports, are these orange orbs. They happen throughout the 20th century, and they happen in the 21st century as well. People are seeing apparently the same exact type of thing. So I think it's part of the same phenomenon.
May 2024 landed, and a photograph emerged of Sean Kirkpatrick in a UAP briefing he denied ever having been in. This resulted in a kind of funny online argument between himself, that's Sean Kirkpatrick, and Skinwalker Ranch owner Brandon Fugel, who him and others were part of that very briefing. And this just goes to show that, and this happens on all sides of the argument. I'm not just being pro-UFO or anti-UFO. Of course I'm not anti-UFO, for the love of God, look what I do. But Sean Kirkpatrick denied ever having been in this sort of thing, and sure enough, there's a picture showing him in that very briefing. So yeah, it was a bad look for Sean Kirkpatrick, and probably one of several for him. And in this month, Colonel Carl Nell, a real tongue twister for me, he attended the 2024 SALT conference, where he made several big statements in front of an audience that isn't exactly the same you'd find at your average UFO convention. This is not a UFO convention. This is an event with serious investors and entrepreneurs hearing high-level talks and conversations from folks involved in various aspects of industry, military-industrial complex, technology, all that sort of thing. And he left no doubt about what he thought about the existence of non-human intelligence, including this quote: "Non-human intelligence exists. Non-human intelligence has been interacting with humanity. This interaction is not new, and it's been ongoing." You can't get much more straightforward than that. And more of that in 2025, please. And by that, I mean high-ranking officials speaking out on platforms like that aren't necessarily UFO platforms. I love to hear these people on podcasts like this and others, documentaries on X Spaces, all the different ways people consume content. But this kind of thing really gets the needle moving. It's needle moving stuff, and it's maybe things we don't see having an impact front and centre, but it certainly makes waves in the background. So yeah, more of that please. And on that, in May, I had Dr. Gary Nolan joining me on the podcast. Gary will be a guest once again this coming January, so get your questions maybe in for that one. Huge lineup of guests for this January. I'll set out that very, very soon. But yeah, so for May, it was Dr. Gary Nolan. And I want to ask Gary, in the last 12 months, I think it's very fair to say that your colleague, I don't know if he's a friend yet, whistleblower David Grush, came forward and has probably had the single biggest impact in the world in terms of UFO UAP. And I say that as someone based in the UK. That made headlines over here. That made our news, which is a very difficult thing for any UFO conversation to do. And recently, another friend of yours, colleague Lou Elizondo, in a statement said he was aware of threats made against himself, his family, and other whistleblowers. I'd love your take on that and how you see that playing out. And do you think this could put a stop to other whistleblowers coming forward?
It certainly casts a pall. I mean, I know the specific incident that Lou is discussing, and it was real, and it's real, and it's ongoing. That information might go public. It's not my place to say it. but it's pretty serious. I mean, look, I got a phone call myself at one point, basically telling me to be careful how I was talking about things. And I won't go into the specifics of what was said and all the rest, but it shook me. It was a call from somebody in the government, or representing what was being said in certain circles, and it was a threat, and that was the first time I ever felt, okay, this is getting personal. It wasn't a threat by them. It was telling me that the way I was talking about things, I needed to be careful, because there are others who will. Knowing, again, what Dave and Lou have been going through, it's like what I said at the SALT conference. It's not, I was asked, what is the best evidence? Absent, a UFO landing on the White House lawn, is what your government is doing about it, and the basically pretzels that they're twisting themselves into to not talk about it or dance around the subject. I mean, if there's nothing there, release the data. I mean, that's just a fact. If there's nothing there, release the data. Or why are you acting so guilty? One of the acts is threatening people. I mean, that's what David Grush filed his complaint about. He didn't file a complaint to say that there are UAP. That's not a whistleblower. That's not whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is about reporting an illegality. You cannot whistleblow just because you know something. You can only whistleblow if it's an illegality. And so that was what Dave was doing. Now, moving forward, people got very upset, let's say last year, and depressed because the NDAA didn't have the UAP Disclosure Act. Well, guess what? It's being rediscussed and it's being rewritten to address last year's problems. So I think, moving forward, just because the opposition won one battle doesn't mean that the war is over.
June 2024 landed, and perhaps a quieter month, perhaps not, depending how you look at it. UAP disclosure language is beginning to be introduced into the bills that would make up the NDAA later in the year. And also the UAP Disclosure Fund is announced, declaring it will support whistleblowers in coming forward and discussing their claims. They need legal representation. That costs money, and that's starting to put together. It's got an interesting board, so folks, if you want to look up UAP Disclosure Fund, you'll see the organisation and who's involved. I interviewed Yuan Feng, who's part of the UAP Disclosure Fund, and what I'll do is I'll play a clip now from Yuan discussing the UAP Disclosure Fund and what it plans to do.
Sure. The UAP Disclosure Fund is a nonpartisan, nonprofit entity, and we are advocating for greater government transparency regarding UAP. And we're going to be doing that by working with Congress directly, working to build a grassroots movement of people who support UAP legislation and transparency, and promoting scientific research. And as the occasion arises, we want to be able to support UAP whistleblowers too. Like I said before, the genesis of this project came last year when I became convinced that it was time to do something that was a little bit more than was happening in the space in terms of political action. And I reached out to Lou Elizondo, and we, immediately, started discussing the idea. He liked it. And so in the beginning, it was a collaboration of us, brainstorming and thinking about what that would look like. And then I was able to start meeting other folks and meeting people in the field. And so over the following several months, it was a lot for me. It was a lot of networking and meeting people. I met Gary Nolan and Chris Mellon, eventually Carl Nell, and inviting people to become part of the project. And we have this joke that we've assembled the Avengers board. We like to call them that. And I think that the reason that all of these individuals agreed and wanted to be part of this project is because they too saw the need for increased political action. And that's really, what we're going to be focused on in the near future. And what, there's so many aspects to the UAP topic, and there's lots of, different lanes that nonprofits and other organizations can operate in. And we feel that we have, a good lane. We're going to be hyper focused on activism within the U.S. government right now, because I do believe that is one step of many towards our greater understanding of the phenomenon.
So right now, you mentioned some of those names. I'll go through the list as it's written on the website. Okay, so we've got the board of directors, will be very familiar names to those in the UFO topic. Luis Elizondo, Gary Nolan, and Carl Nell. The advisory board of Chris Mellon and Kirk McConnell. Executive director is yourself, Yuan Feng. We've got director of strategy, Matt Ford, as many will know from the Good Trouble show, and chief financial officer, Leslie Duckworth. So you've got a relatively small team there. Right now, though, what does the day-to-day or week-to-week running of the UAP Disclosure Fund look like?
Certainly. In addition to who we've posted as our core team on the website, we've got a number of other people who have come to the project over the last couple of months. And so we're formulating our plans for advocating for the UAP Disclosure Act over the next few months. Mm-hmm. And we've got volunteers who are coming to us wanting to help. And so we're trying to, organizationally, we're building the plane as it flies right now. Right now we've got a staff of about 6 people who are volunteering their time. And so we're working on the next steps. We're going to have a website refresh uploaded soon. And then we're going to look at our first campaigns for messaging to Congress directly, messaging to the public, and figure out how we can best advocate moving forward.
We're now halfway through the year as we head into July 2024. July, there was a couple of white papers released from the Sol Foundation. Now, these are available at the Sol Foundation's website. One was on anomalous health threats and another on how the church will respond to an official confirmation of non-human intelligence. Really interesting stuff. Again, some reading for you if you're interested in that over the course of the holidays and beyond. Check out the Sol Foundation's website anyway. Murmurings were also in the air of hearings in the coming months. We did get promised hearings at various points. We were told there was going to be one in September. We know, spoiler folks, those don't happen till November. And also we began to hear that Lou Elizondo's book isn't far off and is due to land on our shelves very, very soon. Here is a clip, though, from that month of Danny Sheen. And I had Danny Sheen on, who's always a really interesting guest. He can be wonderful in what he says, what he knows. He's also very happy to speculate. He comes from an incredibly interesting place. He's got his finger in a lot of UFO pies, folks. And I know those pies aren't always to everyone's taste, but not everything is in the UFO topic. But really interested to hear Danny Sheen talk about the CIA's Golden Domes project. And I'll play a clip of that now for you. But speaking more broadly, if I am someone on one of these crash retrieval programs, I imagine in my head, I think, Danny, like the fire service, where you're sitting about in an office and now and again the bell goes and you go to a fire. You don't drive about looking for fires. How active are these people? And I suppose what I'd like to know is, are you aware of recent crash retrievals happening, or are these very few and far between?
Well, no, but I do know this. I do know that the Central Intelligence Agency itself has a center that nobody knew about. And actually, most other people don't know about now, that was able to detect UFOs flying around, even when they're fully masked. Even when they're not visible at all, and when they don't show up on any radar. That there is a technology that has been developed The code name for it is called Golden Domes, and they're able to detect the UFOs of where they're going and coming. So that, and what I'm concerned about is that may be part of the quote kinetic program, to find out where they are. Because if you can find out where they are, then you might be able to engage them in some way to try to bring them down. And now all of that, all of this kind of deep into the weeds kind of information about how the legislation is going and how we're doing, is separate from the question of whether or not our national security state people are engaged in hostile acts toward them, such as that, or whether they actually have some sort of line of communication going to them, or at least one or more of the species, that has some sort of diplomatic relations with them, that has some sort of an understanding with them, such that they might have been conceivably allowed to have access to one of the craft, or one or more, that are not crashed, that are, and they've got at least a couple fully intact, operational, extraterrestrial, non-human spacecraft. So they've got them, and that makes them probably easier to try to figure out how they run. And then there's a third question that is extraordinarily important. Has there been a set of communications going on with one or more of the species, of the probably 5 at least different species that are commonly understood to be coming and going from here? Has there been any communication with them pursuant to which any of them are cooperating with our national security agencies to help show them how to fly these things? because one of the challenges is that there appears to be, pretty solidly established now, the method by means of which these craft are navigated, are operated, is telepathically. That the pilots of these craft telepathically communicate with the craft, and the craft are some kind of extraordinarily highly developed AI that has got like almost its own consciousness, and that they telepathically communicate with the craft, and it's that way that they navigate. And it's apparently a major challenge to the people in the United States military whose consciousnesses aren't high enough to actually operate the craft. So that there's some challenges like that apparently they've been confronted by. So there are the technical in the weeds legislative questions about where we are with the Schumer bill and what amendments are being proposed in it, and how what's the relationship between the Senate and the House, the Senate under the control of the Democratic Party, the House under the control of the Republican Party. There's a lot of in the weeds kind of questions like that, but there are these other more kind of transcendental questions, about what our relationship is with these beings. Do they have any kind of juridical relationship with each other, these 5 or so different species? Is there some sort of alliance that they have, pursuant to which they're governed by some protocols with regard to whether they can communicate with one or more of our nation states? Do they have to agree to only communicate with all of them together? And these are all things that the problem is that we haven't been able to get the Congress to pay attention yet to those kind of things, because they're still way in the mode of trying to find out for sure whether it's true, that they're even here, So, and they're trying to get, and the challenge of it is they're trying to get the legacy group to come and tell them, and so they're still allowing themselves to be in a position of allowing the legacy group to be the ones that are really going to decide whether they're going to reveal the information or not. And the House of Representatives has specifically refused to allow the panel to be put together to establish this independent board that has subpoena power, and that can issue subpoenas to mandate that the information be provided, and to take depositions if it's withheld, to find out who's got the information and where it is and what the nature of it is, et cetera. So the House of Representatives has still allowed the heads of the different Defense Department agencies and intelligence agencies to make the decision as to whether or not they're even going to admit they've got it. And so what it's really like, to make an unfortunate analogy, is just like the Democratic Party right now is in a position of saying they have to wait for Biden to decide whether or not he's going to withdraw. Like they aren't taking it into their hands to say, look, we're the Democratic Party is faced with this disaster here, that all of the polls are showing that if Biden remains the candidate for the Democratic Party, they're going to lose in kind of a sweep, against Trump. Now, especially now that he has such sympathy of having survived this assassination attempt. And so that the whole Congress is in the same kind of technical position. They're waiting for the very people who are refusing to cooperate to make the decision as to whether they're going to cooperate. And we know that they're not, because they've refused to cooperate for 80 years.
In August, there was only one real talking point, and that was Lou Elizondo's book hitting the shelves. It sold incredibly well, hitting the New York Times bestseller spot. It was a book that landed to mixed reviews from the UFO community, which is always going to happen with anything like this, as it's so subjective. I think I'd be more surprised if something landed, whether it was a book, a documentary, or a series, and everyone liked it or unanimously hated it. It's never going to happen. But it gained a lot of public attention, huge public attention, and it got eyes on the topic, and it also filled in some of the gaps or blanks in Lou's story he perhaps hadn't gone into or couldn't go into in the past. In that month, guest Matthew Pines was fantastic, and I love speaking to Matthew, looking to get him back on to speak about the topic. He's someone who has come out more and more discussing his thoughts on UFOs. He's got a wonderful background, and it's not necessarily UFO centric. But here's a clip of Matthew Pines from August 2024. So something you said then was, coming into the summer, there will be some major things happening. So obviously we're looking at a few big milestones here, but do you want to touch on what you're talking about when you're on that pod saying big things are going to be happening?
Yeah, so the context is sort of where we are in, what has been, I guess, colloquially termed kind of this process of disclosure, and, manifested by kind of official actions, right? And so paying attention to what is, really going to be like the linchpin of any future official movement is legislation, right? And so the context for this year is what sorts of inside and outside activities are in motion or could be in motion to help get the UAPDA passed this year. That seems to be the fulcrum of effort. Obviously, last year was sort of a first wave of pressure, starting with Grush and then Carl now validating it, and then the introduction of the UAPDA, senior co-sponsors, bipartisan fashion, obviously got stripped down pretty significantly in the House in conference committee. And so this is part two, or this is the sort of second hit. And so I expect a similar strategy, right? Except to sort of crank up the notch in terms of public pressure, public discourse, in a controlled fashion to try to get sufficient momentum to push the UAPD across the line, while sort of backroom negotiations always take place on these things as sort of the inside game. So I think to that end, I think some things are coordinated, some things are just, happenstance in terms of various, say, documentary projects that at least I'm aware of have been in the works for a while. Of course, with all sorts of, in the media business, right, you could be close to the final cut and still be months away from actually releasing. So I know those are on the calendar, but those things can always get pushed, months. Obviously, Lou Elizondo's book is the one sort of high confidence release date. We know that's coming out. I think through the leaked versions of some of those chapters, we know he's going to say some pretty eye-opening things, and he's going to go on a book tour, and he's going to be fully unmuzzled to say a lot of things that he hasn't been able to say publicly for the past 2+ years. And so I think that will draw renewed attention in sort of, you might call, mainstream media discourse and sort of the political discourse as we head into a highly charged presidential campaign season. So I think there will be, an increase. These things tend to sort of swing. We'll sort of see a kind of an upswing in the tempo and salience of this topic into the fall. I think the primary objective of that is to try to get as much as the UAP, as much key provisions in the UAPDA passed out of the conference committee in the National Defense Authorization Act, and then give whoever the next president is kind of the mandate to appoint or to nominate those members of the review board and sort of, shift into a different regime.
Let's pick some of those points out then. And you've very nicely set up my next 4 or 5 questions, so thank you for that. So you mentioned that UAPDA was gutted last year. Namely, there's a lot to it, but the 2 big hitters are that presidential review board, where there would be 9 nominated expertise, that would be looking to take through all the records and try and work out what's here, what can we disclose, how do we do this. And the second was eminent domain, where essentially the government can go in and take back anything they see fit related to UAP. And that could be if Matt Pines has a piece of craft alleged to be given to him from Jacques Vallée, they could come into your house, take it, and you can't do anything about it. But also big private aerospace, people at Brandon Fugel and Skinwalker Ranch, they can come in, take your stuff, and you can't say no. Those are gone. Those were gone, but they're back in this time. The bill's going through exactly the same as it was before. Does that make sense to you, putting the bill back through exactly the same?
Well, I mean, it's all politics and the tactics and the dynamics between the personalities on the sort of Senate Select Committee Intelligence and Senate Armed Services side and their sort of key staffers and the House side. My understanding, and I think some folks have said this, is that there was a debate about whether whether the Senate revises or sort of punches up some of the definitions, some of the text. That might require additional wrangling internally on the Senate side to get some of those original co-sponsors on board with those changes. And like anything else, right? Once you've got something that everyone agreed on previously, there's going to be some amount of transaction cost and friction to make any changes. And I think Senator Rounds has stated that, this was about just getting something that they could get over to the House side and say, we're committed to this again. We want to negotiate in good faith. We haven't, move the ball the way we want to move the ball, and let's take at least a consensus step forward in this direction. So, far be it for me, watching on the sidelines to sort of second guess those internal political calculations. I think, as written, the UAPDA would be a milestone, pretty dramatic fashion. I think, obviously you could probably tweak things along the edges, but just getting that passed as is would be a pretty watershed moment. So I would imagine that from the Senate side, that's the overriding objective.
How much does the outcome of the presidential election affect the progress of the bill? As it's trying to go through right now, it seems there's a whole lot going on. And from the outside, the US election is fascinating to watch because it's such a battle of personality rather than policy, as it maybe has been in the past. And I know more about US politics now than I do UK politics. I'm not massively into politics just because how much coverage we see of it on the TV. And it has become this battle of the personalities now between Kamala Harris, Donald Trump. How much do you think that's taking away, or could that potentially help this pass, but then also get this enacted as well?
Yeah, and I am in the heart of the beast in DC, unfortunately. So the pathologies of our political system are manifested every day. On this topic, I would draw attention to some of the findings and declarations language in the UAPDA itself, which mentioned that evidence indicates that legislative and executive oversight has otherwise been lacking on these programs. So elected officials in the executive branch have not been briefed in. There are 2, elected officials in the executive branch, the president and the vice president. So that implies to me the Senate is making a clear statement that from the evidence and testimony that they've been given, that they've inspected, that motivated the UAPDA, and they codify that in a pretty stark language. When they set that out in the findings and declarations, each one of those bullet points carries a lot of weight and setting a pretty strong signal. And a key piece of that signal was essentially that the current vice president, now the nominee for the Democratic Party, has not been read in, has not been made aware of these programs. That's essentially what the Senate said. Now, I can't speak for Vice President Harris in terms of how she might feel about that. I don't know if she's been told about that or how much she has any awareness of the subject. I think I think my default is that she doesn't know a whole lot, even though she was on the Intelligence Committee. She was a relatively junior member. That from any, I think a large portion of the political motivation here on both the Senate side and the potentially in the White House side is a sense of, wait, we're supposed to know these things. We're the ones in charge. I need to know these things. I am in charge. It's an ego thing. It's a power thing. It's a first order, right? And so I can imagine, if it's President Harris who gets, or Vice President Harris who wins the election, that an element of that might be in play, and she, might decide to assert herself in a fashion that she hasn't yet. Donald Trump, is a wild card on almost any topic. So it's hard for me to, handicap what a disclosure process would look like under sort of either scenario. I think there are elements of this though that are going to take place. I think the reason why the UAPDA is important is, from the Senate's perspective, is it kind of helps them get this hot potato and sort of toss it off to an independent group, right? And that also helps the White House, right? It's sort of it's a technocratic kind of bureaucratic maneuver to essentially take a very fraught, very difficult, very sort of politically sensitive and national security sensitive issue and set up like a separate, independent structure, nominally part of the executive branch, but having sort of an independent status, authorities to unilaterally to declassify with the president's sort of override, mandate, testimony, under penalty of perjury, give, request subpoenas, and obviously inspect facilities and make disposition determinations on any technologies of unknown origin and biological materials associated with that. And so I think everyone has an alignment of interest to a certain extent at the political layer to establish this independent group and sort of, hand this hot potato off to that group and then have them kind of charged with, really getting to the bottom of it, coming up with this controlled disclosure campaign plan, sort of a phased, more deliberative disclosure process. And then questions that come to the White House or questions that come to the Senate can just be sort of punted over to this review board. There's a process, there's a timeline. We got serious people. They're looking at it. I can sort of, punt that question.
In September, we were still looking at the kind of fallout and discussion around Lou Elizondo being back on the circuit as such. He'd done some massive podcasts, including Joe Rogan and others. He'd done a lot of mainstream news appearances, and he also was on this podcast as well, and I'll play that clip in just a few moments. We also heard that a Jay Stratton book was coming from the same folks who had released Lou Elizondo's book. Remember, that's Dan Farah, who is a big Hollywood producer and agent. He was involved in Spielberg's Ready Player One and a lot of other movies as well, and he's also producing a documentary that is soon to be released with Lou Elizondo and others, and that is, I imagine, will have fantastic production values and some decent money behind it, just given the folks involved in production. So yeah, looking forward to what that may bring. But yeah, with the Jay Stratton book being announced, that was really interesting, and there was a lot of talk perhaps Stratton is looking to share his side of the story, given it seems he is a major player in all of this, especially when you look at things like the UAP Task Force, AIMSOG, Arrow. His name props up in so many UFO conversations and organisations whenever people talk about it. He really does seem to be a key player in this topic from the last couple of decades. And a new director was confirmed to head up Arrow, and that was Dr. John T. Kozlowski, who we would eventually see speaking a few months later in front of senators in one of those November hearings. But anyway, to round off September 2024, here is a clip from
we hear a lot about the public side of it now from yourself and what you can talk about. Some really interesting stuff. We'll talk about Chapter 8, and not expecting you to remember that, Lou. Groups like the Collins Elite being at loggerheads against legacy UAP programs, I thought was really interesting, that little nugget, and personally hadn't really thought about gatekeepers or secrecy keepers being at odds with each other, and that's a really interesting concept when you think they're not on our side as such. So with the powers that be not necessarily working together harmoniously, is there any chance that good can come from that in terms of any UAP disclosure, that you start to get leaks or dissenting individuals who want to maybe break rank?
Yeah. I mean, I think, speaking truth to power is critical, especially in the national security apparatus for any country. Look, I want to be clear here because people will say Colin's elite and they say, oh, Christian fundamentalists. Look, there's nothing wrong with being necessarily a fundamentalist. There's a problem with being a radical. It doesn't matter whether it's Christian or Muslim or Jewish or Buddhist or any type of radicalization is problematic because it can interfere with proper decision making that's good for the larger group. So I want to be clear. I'm not picking on. I'm deeply spiritual myself. So this is not a Christian thing. People say, "Oh, you crazy Christian fundamentalists." No. Wait a minute. That's not what I was saying. What I was simply saying is that radicalism, by any other label, is still radicalism, right? You just whether you're wearing a Christian robe or you're wearing a robe by any other thing doesn't matter. So I want to be very careful to separate, those individuals who are identified in the book. It's not that they're Christians, so they're bad. It's the opposite. They were bad and they happen to be Christian. And even I don't think they were bad. Ultimately, I think they were doing in their heart what they felt is right. And for that, I can't blame them. I don't agree with it, but I don't blame them for them doing what they did because in their hearts, they believe they were doing the right thing for the right reasons. This goes to the bigger conversation of truths in the world. There are two types of truths in the world. Believe it or not. People say, no, there's no truth is only the truth. No, it's not. It's actually, there's two types. There's universal truth, such as, for example, gravity, right? Affects us all equally, or at least most of us, maybe me a little more sometimes. But gravity is real for everyone. And then so that's a universal truth. Then you have a personal truth. And a personal truth can be just as strongly adopted and believed and accepted as a universal truth, but it's not by everybody. So politics, religion, culture, things like that, where people are willing to die for because it's just as true to them as gravity, but it's not universally accepted. And so we need to understand that the difference between a personal truth and a universal truth, because there are differences. And do we have a right to allow our personal truths to affect our decision-making process as if it was a universal truth? Honestly, I can't answer that. I don't know that. I personally try to separate both. And that's why I'm always very clear to caveat what is my opinion. I may believe it very strongly, but it's still my opinion, right? And I'm very clear to make that distinction where others, it's maybe a little more challenging to do that.
As we speed towards the end of the year, October 2024 saw the trailer for James Fox's documentary, The Programme, finally dropping. It was one that had been long anticipated, and I think along with Lou Elizondo's book, were two of the big drops people were looking forward to this year. And they came later in the year, and I think that the second half of the year has certainly proven a lot more exciting and interesting than the first ended up being. The New Paradigm Institute announced Global Disclosure Day would take place on the 20th of October. This was an online live streamed event, which promoted the grassroots movements from around the globe coming together to talk about the work they were doing and its importance. Of course, some well-known names got involved as well to share their work and support the initiative. I'm not totally sure if I remember correctly, but around this time, really close to that date, I'm sure there was some damaging news about the UAP Disclosure Act 2.0, its likelihood of not passing in the NDAA, and that softened the impact of the whole Global Disclosure Day. But the big takeaway for me, though, was the efforts of normal citizens doing their part to raise awareness. And I've got some of those folks who were involved in that, including Ryan Perky and Stan Ho, coming on the podcast very, very soon to discuss aspects of what they do out there in Hong Kong. And also, big story this month, Immaculate Constellation is reported on by journalist Michael Schellenberger. He says that a whistleblower has come forward to him to discuss a top-secret special access program that focused on crash retrievals. This was a huge moment and carried on momentum through the hearings in November, and I think this is one that's going to play a part in 2025 as well. If people were looking for something to really dig their teeth into in the UFO topic and get progress,
this is something. This is a big one, but this is also one that's going to have big pushback as well. Huge guest on the podcast this October, the wonderful Sarah Gamm, who was an analyst for the UAP task force. She was on the podcast. Great to speak to. I split it into two parts, especially for two very differing conversations with her. So here is a clip from Sarah Gamm. You've got your time in the task force. Do you remember maybe the first time you had some data, be it, numbers on a sheet of paper, which a geek like you would love, someone like myself wouldn't understand, but you're a self-professed geek, or a picture or a video that you really had to sit back and go, wow, wait a minute, this is something a bit different. Do you remember that moment? And maybe I'm not
Yeah, of
asking you to
course.
talk about what it was,
Yes.
but what was it like?
It was disbelief and kind of takes your breath away. I mean, I've seen what I thought was a UFO in person, and you just stare at it and you're like, did I? No. And my first thought isn't to get my cell phone out to take a video of what I'm seeing. It's to breathe. And that was kind of a similar moment of okay, rewind. I need to watch this again. Okay, yep, hit play and pause and zoom in, and my brain's playing tricks on me. No, that has to be a balloon, and start second guessing and going through the Rolodex in my brain of what else it could be. And watching it again and then chatting with another person, my colleague who was very science based. And so I'm like, can you just take a quick gander at this? I just want to make sure before I say something to somebody else. And he'd take a look and be like, what was that? I'm like, okay, that's all I needed. And yeah, it was a very memorable experience. I'm going to say my first reaction was to remind myself to breathe again, because it's just a moment that catches your breath. And then rewatch it and rewatch it again, and then send it to somebody else and read up on who I could reach out to who might have submitted it or whatever.
So safe to say then it's a video. And is it
Yeah.
is it yeah. Is that video out in the public domain?
No.
Okay. The rest of that day, how does that affect you? Because I think this is something that most folks can't appreciate. I probably don't either. But when someone works doing the job you do, or a David Grush, or a Louis Elizondo, or any other countless number of folks involved in the kind of work we're talking about here, essentially looking at UFO data, I don't think they maybe realise that at the end of the day, they clock out, they finish their shift, and they have to go home. So that day, you'll have travelled home, and you'll have sat down, and you'll have put the TV on. Is that not a world changing moment to really have that sort of information in your head now?
I've never thought of that. I think because of my spiritual world, some of this isn't a surprise. So when I go home, it's like maybe I just need to meditate and sit with myself in some silence for a little bit. But yeah, I don't recall going home and having this momentous moment, because being a spiritual person and seeing the other side, that I guess maybe it just wasn't that big of a surprise to me, because I've always known we weren't alone. But I do remember driving home and being like, I wish I could call somebody. This is so cool. And of course not being able to. So yeah, meditation it was.
That's fair enough. Do you not get friends asking you at parties after a few drinks, Sarah, what have you seen? What's it like? And
Definitely. I think sometimes they get more curious. A few people might, but they also know that I can't talk about my work, and so they don't want to risk me going to jail. And they know I likely won't survive. Um, but yeah, friends do get curious, and I do share what I can, or I might share with them some of my spiritual stuff if we get curious enough. But not everybody likes to hear that either. So yeah, they get curious, but they also respect my boundaries.
there's definitely some questions that I won't waste your time asking, because I know what's going to come back with, you can't discuss. And there are various reasons people like Sarah can't discuss, including locations, quality of video, the sensor systems being used, stuff like that. And that's just because I've had multiple guests on in the past, like Lou Elizondo, people like that who can't discuss that kind of information. So, but you have said that you've seen a lot of blurry data that we see in the public, blobs and pixelated videos and such.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that when you view those blurry videos and images, that you know exactly what other sensor systems either would be useful to look at with them? So in my head, I'm thinking Tic Tac, Gimbal, Go Fast. So those are the three. I'm going to call them boring videos, Sarah, because I feel they're boring and prosaic enough they were allowed to be released. And it seems at this point we know there is extended footage of at least some of them, which show some more interesting things like maneuverability, maybe clarity, acceleration, stuff like that we're not allowed to see, because I think even that would make the public go, oh. But right now, those three videos are out there and the public largely haven't sat up and took notice. So when you're watching Tic Tac, Gimbal, Go Fast, are all three of those videos for you and what you know and your expertise enough to think these are something completely exotic, or do you still think either of the three could be prosaic?
I mean, I trust what's been done before, so I don't like to duplicate effort and to reanalyze, because that work was done and it was good work, and a lot of good work was put forth to get it declassified and released to the public. So I don't like looking at something like that all again and again. But yes, there's more data that shows we're not alone, to in my opinion, of course, and a few others. But I do get, I guess, a lot of comments about how people can't believe I haven't, talked more about those, but those have already been talked about. To me, it's like, let's move on to the fresh stuff, and let's move on towards disclosure instead of talking about these. They're incredible, so I'm not downplaying what they are. They are incredible, but work has been done on them. Taxpayer dollars have been paid, and yeah.
I'll give an example for you on that, why some of this stuff isn't released. And as I'm not a US citizen, but just purely from a UFO conversation, I'd love to see all this stuff released, and to hell with national security, but that's not how the real world works. Now, I've heard there is a video which was filmed by like US military, whatever it may have been, at quite a distance, a pretty spectacular distance from a Russian ship. And in observing this ship, they filmed multiple UAP. Now, they weren't meant to be where they were. And I think everyone knows at this point, Russia, US, China, every country spies on each other. That's just, that's not a secret. But these UAP were filmed by coincidence. So that footage is meant to be spectacular, but you can't release it even if you wanted to, if you were the US, because then it shows you've been spying on Russia. So there are things like that, and I'm not going to ask Sarah to even follow up on that, because she couldn't if she wanted to. But that kind of stuff, and that I talked about that with Jeremy Corbell, if anyone wants to go back, are sort of some of the reasons that this stuff can't be shown, but I'm guessing would be the type of thing that, Sarah, you have potentially seen within your work at the task force. Is that in the ballpark?
Yes.
Okay, that's fair. What sort of percentage of material and data do you look at that you would say, without doubt, is truly anomalous / exotic / NHI? Now, that's not to say, I'm sure you've seen some videos, Sarah, where there are objects maneuvering pretty incredibly with weird shapes and sizes, but they are Chinese, Russian, US, etc. Really, really high tech gadgetry. What percentage of stuff do you see that you would say is truly, the good stuff that we would like to know about?
I'd say it is a small percentage, because there are a lot of balloons out there, and other objects that make it seem it's unidentified, and the data quality isn't the best. Man, I would say I've tried to put a percentage on this before, and it's really hard, because it is more of a letdown than anything because it can be described, or especially like weather balloons are looking crazier and crazier now, and they're up in the air longer. So
Less than 10?
I'm trying. Oh yeah, I was gonna say 5%.
Okay. I think I've gone 5% before in the past, and from a place of pure no knowledge, just speculation, I would imagine a lot of this stuff that gets posted online or is seen are misidentifications or adversarial tech. And I think those shoot downs from February 2023 showed us that these balloons that are being used, I think it was a Chinese balloon at one point, that's really what you would presume is low tech from what you would expect in 2023. But it seemed to be pretty effective because it seems it had been there and was undetected. And I'm guessing that kind of stuff's been going on. So, one thing I would be interested in knowing as best you can is what sort of spread do you see or have you seen with the data that objects are either water based, air based, or above the atmosphere?
Good question. Um, I will say I think it's probably because of the data I was looking at, I didn't observe a lot of water stuff. So I, I mean, water was even a smaller percentage of that. I would say there was only like, one, maybe two videos that ended up being something unidentified from water. But I wasn't an expert at marine things,
Yeah.
and so it was not my forte. Especially looking at SAR imagery. SAR imagery doesn't do the best over water, and especially massive water
That's fair.
areas. So um, yeah, a lot of the other things that you asked, I would say definitely a smaller percentage, but most of what I looked at was land based. So I was looking at terrain and or maybe clouds or yeah.
So that would indicate stuff. Clouds would be stuff higher up in the air, but is being caught by imagery, as you would think.
Yes.
Space-based stuff must be mega sensitive, just because of, I'm guessing, the quality of technology and whatnot that may be in the air, and we know there are thousands of satellites. Elon Musk seems to be throwing them into space like they're toys at the minute to him. But I wonder, and this will be a hard one for you to talk on, I'm presuming, but as best you can, and hopefully the question makes sense. Are there differences that you could tell or see from any captured imagery, data, or video that would stand out, you would see because it was space-based capture as opposed to it being in the air or underwater? There were maybe particular traits that you didn't see when something was in the air?
I would be able to see depending on the sensor. So I'm going to try to answer this best I can without uh yeah.
Going to
So
jail, yeah.
when yeah, thank you. When you look at something from a different sensor, it also is a different perspective, right? So physics is about when you solve a problem and you solve a problem from a different perspective, you get a completely different answer. So that's the same thing with your camera angle, right? You get a different sun glint off of an object. So infrared is typically less resolution, but you get a sun angle or you get a heat signature somewhere different than you would in something else. So each item, each sensor that I was able to look at definitely provided a different layer of validation. Sometimes depending on the sensor, it's easier to tell if something's a balloon or not. Like one of my jobs over the years, because I'm very open that I'm a part of the UAP community when I start a job, is I don't want the stigma, or I'm very open about it. And so, my office will quickly know that to come to me if they find anything, or if, oh, I was out hiking the other night and I saw something, I took a video, can you look at it? So everybody knows that I'm happy to talk to them about all this stuff. So one day I came back from a vacation and they were like, "Oh my gosh, we captured a UAP." And I look at it, and the whole office for days thought that this was a UAP. They were certain. And I took a look at it for half a second and I was like, "That's a balloon." So I totally bursted their bubble, and I felt bad because I don't like telling somebody when they think they really captured something, but I'm going to look at what the data is, and that was a balloon. I'm like, okay, look at the sun angle, and it's glinting, and look at it moving. It's moving along the wind path, and so yes, it's depending on the sensor, you definitely get different perspective on what you're looking at.
I'm presuming there's not many balloons in space. What would be some of the misidentifications and outside the atmosphere?
Um, the misidentification is because you have an object higher and then and looking at an object lower. So you also have Earth's rotation. So things might be out of sync a little bit. So that becomes like a little bit of parallax, right? So things are moving at a different speed or a different direction than what you think you are because your sensor and the object and then Earth are all moving at different times and different velocities. So the movement, so the movement and even the sun, so the sun might be over here or might be back here where this crazy cat is, and so with the object moves and then the satellite moving, you got all kinds of different physics happening, right? So the sun angle might glint at something, maybe the payload on a balloon a little bit differently. I hope I answered that properly.
In November 2024, this month was all about the hearings, and we got two after waiting all year for one. In the UK, we've got a phrase that you wait for a bus all day and eventually two come along at once. I don't know if you've got similar where you are, but that's what it was like with the hearings. Now, the House Oversight Committee hearing was made up of four witnesses testifying, who were Luis Elizondo, retired Rear Admiral Timothy Gallaudet, Michael Gold, a former NASA Associate Administrator, and journalist Michael Schellenberger, who was representing the Immaculate Constellation document whistleblower. Reactions from this ranged, of course, from historic to historic nothing burger and everything in between. Next up was the Senate Armed Services Committee, where Senator Kirsten Gillibrand led a low-key affair discussing the latest ARROW findings as new director John T. Kozlowski flew through some reports, and it's still early in his tenure, so he's limited as to how much access and work he would have done as part of ARROW in just those kind of few months, and we'll see how that pans out and plays going into the new year. Enough big names have said they're willing to give him a chance again, but it feels we keep coming back to this with ARROW, don't we, on a maybe yearly basis or 18-month basis at this point. So let's see if ARROW brings anything to the table of substance. That month, I had guest George Knapp on the podcast. Journalist George Knapp needs no introduction, and he was discussing, among many things, his latest documentary series, which landed on Netflix, which I really enjoyed. So go and check that out, Investigation Alien, if you get a chance, folks. Here is George to wrap us up and lead us into December. Yeah, I think even when you hear people like Sarah talking about how an aspect, a very small aspect of the work was even done where it was a chat room and there would be a folder in the chat room and you would jump in, look at the pictures and just chat while you were doing your other job. And I think unless you're in that world, it must be very difficult to even try and understand that's how these things work. And I think for a long time, I was very much at peace with the fact ATIP wasn't a official program, but it was something that was happening. Yeah. Lou Elizondo was working on something that was to do with UFOs, UAP, and now we're just getting to that point of more detail. I think it's just like you say, by design probably sounds about right.
My understanding of Lou's role for OSAP, for example, he was in some meetings. So they had some meetings and a dinner, and he was in with these guys. And I think those meetings, he was asked if OSAP became a special access program, which is what Senator Reid tried to do. If it became that, they wanted him to be the counterintelligence officer. So that's why that was his entry point for that. And then after he saw OSAP, my understanding is he was not part of it. He wasn't active with OSAP, but he became interested and started poking around. He had clearances that he could access some of this information and started studying and learning about it. And then ATIP came along. That's a whole different story. But OSAP was real. And before you leave that behind, in my testimony that I submitted to Congress a year ago, in July of 2023, I said, hey, this was a real program. It was really big. It produced not only this giant data warehouse, but more than 100 highly technical reports, explosive information. One of the first ones being about the Tic Tac, 143 pages of physics and engineering data and analysis of the Tic Tac and its capabilities, what the propulsion might be. Not one page of that stuff has been released. Everybody files FOIAs, including me, for it. And not one page of that has been released. The only thing that's released is these 38 DIRDs that were released. I released a bunch of them with or without permission. I put them out. But the bulk of what OSAP did has not been seen by the public at all. I told Congress that July of last year. If they've tried to get it, they haven't succeeded. I don't think they've even asked.
I'll pull you back then to July of last year. You were sat behind Grush, Fravor, Graves at those hearings. Are you disappointed at the lack of progress from that day's events? The biggest for me being, as I spoke to Tim Burchett a few days ago, that they've never managed to get Grush into a skiff to follow up on a lot of that. So it seems like nothing, publicly anyway, really happened off the back of it.
Well, I am disappointed, in the sense that how hard can it be to get a skiff? I don't understand that. Members of Congress, whether somebody up top higher than them is blocking that, but it doesn't seem to be that hard to do. But on the other hand, look, I've been at this a long time, Andy. Look at this gray hair. I mean, 37 years of this stuff, and mostly it was me beating my head against the wall and getting no reaction at all from Congress or official government agencies or even the public at some times. But the last 7 years, we've been spoiled by how much progress has been made. To me, this last 7 years has been astonishing in how far we've come in what to me seems like a very short time. So yeah, there is frustration that Dave Grush hasn't been to a skiff yet, and nobody's been able to ask him these questions or give protection to him and other whistleblowers. But on the other hand, it looks like a heck of a lot of progress from my standpoint.
Yeah, I think a bird's eye view can often be missed with these things as to how much has gone on in that time. And in that year and a half, where is David Grush? Where has he been?
He's keeping his head low. I think he's waiting for other people to come forward and get out on that limb with him. I think he feels a little bit lonely in that he went out on a limb, said things up to a point that he was allowed to say. He got Dopser permission to say this and that, but he didn't go further. He certainly didn't go as far as he could. He has a lot of information, a lot of very specific information that he could convey. And I think he was hoping that after he came forward, that some other people at those levels of position, people that he knows a lot more than him, would go ahead and say something. And they haven't done it yet. We've had some books that have come out, and we have another book that's coming. But I think David would appreciate that some of the folks that he interacted with and worked for and with would get out there and do what he's done.
There was a rumoured op-ed coming from David Grush. Is that something you know of, or is that just being kept low along with him?
Well, it's been written for a long time. It's just a matter of finding the right place to do it. And I think he's been dissatisfied with the options that have been available to him. So I think he's probably keeping his powder dry for the time being. He's not sure where all this is going to go, especially with all the discussion about Trump administration, Trump himself, and some of the people in his circle who are supposedly pro-transparency, and they're going to make a big announcement. And I think he's kind of holding his breath to see what happens, how that all shakes out.
I suppose timing would be a big thing for that. Rather than just he drops it tonight randomly, sure, the UFO community would be a buzz, but does that get the public attention? Does it get the political attention and the right officials? Have you been intrigued to see the names that Trump has picked for his cabinet going forward? Because there does seem to be a lot of pro or friendly UAP voices on there, doesn't there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm encouraged by that. I try not to get too hopeful because after all these years and all the promises and all the predictions I've heard about, oh boy, yeah, this is the year. Here it comes. They're going to open up the hangars. There's the saucers. Go take a look. Heard these kinds of promises many, many times, including from presidents and presidential candidates, and it never seems to happen. Maybe, after the president gets elected, he's there in office. Somebody comes in and knocks on the door and has a little chat with him about the nature of this subject matter and what's really at stake. But so far, other than a couple of innocuous comments and general acceptances that there's a legitimate mystery here, we haven't really seen much from presidential level announcements. Would that change this time? Let's see. I hope so. I'm not holding my breath.
And just before we move on from the hearings and that document, the Immaculate Constellation document Jeremy gave over and Michael Schellenberger seemed to represent on the day, do you know who the author of the document is?
Yes.
Yeah. If I asked you if it was David Grush, would you be able to say yes or no?
I'm going to say it right now. No, it's not. It's not Dave Grush. No.
That's fine. I'm not going to waste your breath asking you who it was then. Unless you want to spill those beans right now, that would be fantastic. But does it even matter at this point who writes that document? If we found out, would it make a difference?
I think it does make a difference because of how that information came to this person, this individual. So, and, I'm not going to tell that story. Somebody else is going to tell that story. But, it's pretty much laid out in that document.
So we will find out who it was.
I hope so.
You would expect.
Yeah, I would expect so. Yeah.
And the year isn't quite over yet, George, and it seems to have really picked up pace as it's gone on. And I want to discuss a few different aspects of it. First off, yourself, weaponized has been a big part of folks in ufology's life over the last year. You and Jeremy have fit a lot into a very busy schedule that you both keep. Obviously, at times I've reached out to both of you to ask what you were up to, and you've not been available for different reasons, but I'm going to get to talking about your documentary. We know Jeremy's always, I think Jeremy films his whole life pretty much in case something happens, he can get it into documentary format.
True, that's true.
And finally, folks, December 2024. I'll wrap it up here as you've been listening to these December interviews recently, so I'm not going to play a December clip, but I'll just leave you with some final thoughts. I'd say it was a month about two things. One was James Fox's documentary, The Programme, finally being available to watch, and you can go and check out my interview, which many of you have done already, so thank you, with James. And of course, it was all about drones. This was a story that began in November in the UK, and as I record this in late December 2024, there are sightings all across the east coast of the US, especially around New Jersey and beyond, and they're still ongoing. I've commented already that it's certainly strange. Do I think it's non-human? No. Would I want it to be? Obviously. I think it's very much terrestrial, but what it is, who it's from, and why it's up in the air, it's quite literally unknown. It's a UFO, but I don't think it's anything extraterrestrial. I think there are an interesting few weeks ahead to see if the sightings keep up as President Trump is sworn in January. Will he take any action? Will the outgoing administration take any action on their way out? And will Trump have any impact on the disclosure process? Who knows? On that, Ross Coulthart has hinted that all hell will break loose in early 2025, so I don't think we're going to have long to wait. And if you're listening to this at the end of January 2025, I would suspect we would already know by this point, and I'd be disappointed if we didn't, of what Ross was talking about. It's been a hell of a year for me doing this podcast again, and 2025 sees the 5-year anniversary of the podcast in May, and a big thank you from me to everyone who's listened, shared, supported, or even signed up to the podcast as well. I would hope maybe this is the year I can finally do this as my kind of full-time job. Who knows? But it is a full-time job, and people know I work separately anyway. But to finish off, I just want to say you can go and take advantage of a paid membership and support me in the podcast. You can also get free trials of the podcast on Patreon and Apple. Otherwise, just sign up to the straight memberships on Spotify if you type That UFO Podcast Premium on Spotify, and also YouTube memberships are available as well. All of that makes a huge, huge difference. I'll be here all year to continue bringing you interviews, news, reviews, and everything in between, and I hope you're there along for the ride. I've got some good ideas. Well, I think they're good ideas for the podcast that'll kind of bleed in as the months and year goes along to make sure it gets bigger and better than it's been before. But listen, that's all from me for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great new year, folks, and here's to an incredibly interesting 2025.
That is all for this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. Don't forget to leave the podcast a review on your chosen platform. Apple and Spotify do make a huge difference to the algorithm. If you're checking the show out on YouTube, please don't forget to like and leave a comment on here as well. Any sharing you do is very much appreciated on any social media platform. And finally, you can listen to shows ad-free and sponsor-free in their glorious full versions by subscribing for less than the price of a coffee on Apple, Spotify, just search That UFO Podcast Premium. YouTube, you can sign up and be a member, or you can do that through patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, folks.
It wasn't a tic-tac and not quite a saucer, more like a hubcap designed by Chaucer, a little baroque and quite steampunk, like Alice was playing bass for the Parliament of Folk. The little fucker hovered right outside of my window, and when I shoved out the screen, he made it an issue. I don't think he expected me to see his ass, but I'd had some champagne and smoked a little grass.